All right, hi guys, Ollie here from On Your Game Physiotherapy. Today I'm going to be talking to you guys about muscle knots. I'm going to be talking about what they are, why they come about, how best to treat them. I know I've had a lot of patients recently who've got really tight upper backs, and you can definitely feel a lot of knots across the body. So I just thought I'd come in here to troubleshoot a few issues that people are having and sort of wondering why they come about. I also want to say a massive congratulations to Stretton McCrory ladies team who won the league yesterday. Congratulations to you all that are on here. So let's get right into it. First of all, what is a knot? Muscle knots are hard, sensitive areas of muscle that tighten and contract. They can also be known as a trigger point. So if you hear me say trigger point today, I'm talking about muscle knots. They're interchangeable. It just means the same thing pretty much. So I think the best way to describe a muscle knot is if we use a hairband, actually. So imagine I'm talking about the bicep right now. So right now it's fully extended, it's elongated, so it's like that. Basically, with a muscle knot, it's a contraction. So we can probably do it like this. I'm just gonna do it with one strand. Imagine this is one strand of muscle, and it contracts and it forms this sort of bumpy nodule that we have. That's just a thickening of the muscle pretty much. So that's a strand of muscle with a muscle knot. It contracts and it stays in that position and it causes that bump that we feel. Okay, so that's the premise of what a muscle knot is. Basically, muscle knots can cause aching sensations. It can also cause pain in the muscle. When you touch a knot, as I just mentioned, it could feel swollen, tense, it can feel bumpy. You can also usually feel that it's tight and contracted, even when you're trying to relax. And for the most part, knots are extremely sensitive to touch as well. So when you try and dig into a knot, it's going to feel more painful than usual. The affected area can become inflamed and swollen, and you can usually find that with muscle knots, they occur in lots of the same areas, and especially across the upper back. And then sort of as time goes by, more and more knots can be caused, and that's for a few reasons that I'll be talking about today. Some symptoms that we've all experienced, I'm sure, due to muscle knots are headaches, muscle aches, and also in severe cases, we can get pins and needles as well. So I'm going to be talking to you guys first about some of the reasons that muscle knots are caused. But I just thought I'd preface by saying one of the problems that we have with talking about muscle knots is scientifically there's not actually one big reason for us to get the muscle knots. We haven't been able to find out the exact cause of them, but there are some really good suggestions that have been put out there, which I'm going to touch on today, okay? So basically, the first one I'm going to talk to you about is when muscles contract, neurons release a neurotransmitter, which we call acetylcholine. And basically, this happens at the neuromuscular junction. And what happens is this acetylcholine will bind to a muscle cell, causing sodium ions to rush inside, which creates an action potential, which you can think of like a signal traveling across a muscle cell. And this will eventually lead to the release of calcium ions inside the muscle cell. And now in the presence of calcium, thick and thin filaments of muscle will bind together and change shape. This is what we call a contraction. Okay, so what I just explained there is just describing what a contraction is and how a contraction is formed. So this acetylcholine is the reason, this neurotransmitter acetylcholine is the reason that we can flex our muscles, we can shorten the muscles, and they can turn into a contraction, okay? So this is really important to understand if we're going to get better knowledge of trigger points, because as we know, trigger points come hand in hand with muscle tightness as well. So that's sort of what I explained earlier. With muscle tightness, this can then cause that shortening, that contraction of the muscle, leading to the nodule, which we call a trigger point, and so on. Okay, so researchers have wondered maybe there might be a hyper release of this acetylcholine. Obviously, if we've got more acetylcholine in the muscle, we're then going to experience more of a contraction. Okay, so basically the first test that these researchers did, which is really fascinating, is they used Botox. Now, we all know Botox as something that we'll put on our faces. Basically what Botox does is it paralyzes a muscle. So that's why it's so effective at reducing wrinkles, okay? So imagine we've just injected some Botox into our face. It's now numb, we can't move it. But in turn, it also really reduces wrinkles. So that's why people like it. Anyway, they did this within musculature across people who have knots in their back, and they obviously put this Botox in. It acts as a blocker for the acetylcholine. So they were thinking, if we can stop the muscle from contracting, brilliant, we're going to reduce all the muscle knots, okay? But what the research found was, even though, yes, the Botox worked a treat and it was able to completely stop the muscles from contracting, patients were still, or the people within the study were still experiencing pain. Okay, so even though they had this Botox that was put into their upper back and it stopped the muscles from obviously contracting, causing the knots, they would still get pain in the area. And you would think that with the muscle relaxed, it would take the pain away, but the nociceptors, the muscle receptors, didn't allow this to happen, which is fascinating within itself. So that's the first sort of hypothesis the scientists made as to why knots are caused. It's a hyper amount of acetylcholine within the body, and more acetylcholine leads to more contracture, leading to more, obviously, of that tensed up muscle, leading to more knots. So anyway, as back to the science. As I said earlier, this acetylcholine causes muscle contraction. In order to remove the contraction, we need something called adenosine triphosphate. So now we're thinking about a muscle in a contracted position. How do we get it back to that relaxed position, okay? So ATP, also known as adenosine triphosphate, is basically the energy muscles use in order to conduct movement. So in order for our bodies to produce ATP, we need high enough quantities of it, which we find in oxygen. Well, we can get it from oxygen, I should say. So basically, this ATP comes through the capillaries, and it's obviously it's made through the use of oxygen. Okay, I'm just going to put in a quick side note. This is also one of the reasons cramp occurs. Is with cramp, what's happening is the body doesn't have enough oxygen to stop the cramping, which causes the flicking and it causes the tenseness. So at its core, cramp is the body saying we don't have enough energy to stop the contraction, we don't have enough ATP to be able to say to the muscle stop, which is also quite fascinating. So other researchers thought, what happens if we look at a muscle knot like an energy crisis? Let's say, for example, we have bad posture, we were hunched forward, we've been at work all day for 8 hours, and this is maybe over a long period, and we've been completely hunched over. What if this rotation of the shoulders is then putting pressure on the capillaries? When we put tension on the capillaries, this interferes with the delivery mechanism of oxygen to the muscle cells. So if we don't have a way of stopping the contraction, then the muscle will be in a constant state of tightness. And, you know, even if we could then think about relaxing the muscle by sitting in an upright position, we've already had this long-term effect of the lack of oxygen to the muscles. So they were thinking maybe if we don't get this, oxygen, we're not getting that ATP, which is then leading to a constant state of contraction because we're not able to have that thing that allows the muscle to move. So also this is why massage is good for knots, because use of massage can obviously bring an influx of blood flow to the area and surrounding areas, bringing more oxygen to the area. And it also helps to break up that contracted muscle tissue, which then in turn restores our range of movement and relieves a lot of the pain from the area. So the final theory I'm going to be talking to you guys about relating to muscle knots is basically people have theorized what causes muscle knots within the body is a buildup of lactic acid. When the muscle is working, it needs energy. As I mentioned, this energy comes from blood, which carries oxygen, which the muscle needs to continue activity. When there isn't adequate oxygen for the muscle, it then works anaerobically, which is basically a way of saying without oxygen. Okay, so we've got aerobic exercise with oxygen, anaerobic exercise without oxygen. The body then, when we're working anaerobically, produces lactic acid to continue muscular activity, but this creates an oxygen debt. When the activity ceases and the oxygen levels increase, this will oxidize the lactic acid, turning it into carbon dioxide and water, which will then be released through our lymph, okay? But what can happen is occasionally tiny bits of lactic acid can remain in the muscle, which causes knots, okay? The lactic acid can get stuck in a muscle and it can crystallize, which we know as knots, okay? So imagine lactic acid as like a honey that sticks, when you've got glue or something on your fingers and it's sticking it together. We can picture lactic acid the same way, okay? So there are 3 of the most common theories as to why muscle knots occur. What do I think? I tend to think that muscle knots are sort of caused from probably a mixture of all of them. I think that all of them have an impact on us getting knots. And I think that, for the most part, we see knots caused by high amounts of activity, which would suggest lactic acid. We see it from really bad posture, which would suggest that energy crisis. So I think there's probably a host of reasons why knots are found within the body. But to be honest with you, it doesn't really matter because we treat knots within the clinic exactly the same way we would. Doesn't matter what the issue that caused them is, okay, or how they come about. We'll treat them exactly the same way. And I'm going to talk to you guys now about the best forms of treatment for knots if you are to get one. So I would say personally, in the short term, the best form of rehabilitation for getting knots and getting this tightness is always massage therapy, okay? What massage therapy does, as I mentioned earlier, is it increases blood flow to the area, which obviously gets more oxygen, gets more of the nutrients that we need. This can help increase muscular function. It can help loosen up the muscles, in turn reducing the pain, reducing the stiffness. I want you to keep in mind that usually with massage therapy, it will take more than 1 session to reduce the amount of knots that we have. Usually people who are suffering from knots for a long time need up to 5-6 sessions to try and reduce that that tenseness and that stiffness we find, especially in the upper back. Also, something I wanted to mention that's really fascinating about knots as well is something called referred pain. So if you were to get knots in your lower traps, so that's sort of around this area across the lower body, if you were to press into it, as I'm sure many of you had, you'd be like, oh, my upper arm hurts, I'm getting pain across my neck. And that's all to do with the knots that you have, and it's another way knots work in mysterious ways. It's that nerve sensation which carries out throughout the body, and by pressing into one area, we're then getting multiple areas that get that referred pain, okay? So what I'm going to talk to you guys about is some of the types of massage that we use within clinic to get rid of the knots. The first one that we like to use, which we always use, is something called effleurage, which means to skim in French. We use effleurage in everyday massage, not just for knots. Basically, effleurage is perfect for exciting the muscle tissue. They usually look like long strokes, long gliding, not too hard either. We're just trying to excite that muscle tissue and get more blood to the area and get you used to the sensation of touch. Next time, if you're getting a massage, whenever, feel for the sensations, feel for the touches that the massage therapist is providing. Usually, first of all, it will be those effleurage strokes. We can also see this as circles as well. It's usually just a way of exciting the muscle tissue, as I said. And that can be perfect for relieving the trigger points themselves, because obviously with new blood means more oxygen, means less of that tightness, okay? But there's a really good way of us utilizing massage to get rid of knots, and it's something called trigger point therapy. Now, with trigger point therapy, what we do is we get our thumb, we get our elbow, we feel for a really sensitive spot, we feel for one of those bumpy nodules, and we just stick our finger in and we hold it there for about 30 seconds to a minute and release, and that will help massively reduce your knots, okay? So I'd say, first of all, best form of method of recovery if you're experiencing tightness in the upper back anywhere and experiencing knots is definitely to go and get a massage. On top of massage, a couple of the other ways we can look to relieve the stress that they cause is through light stretches. So I know if you were to come into clinic to see me, we'd work through a whole host of stretches across the affected areas. We'd be looking to do some trap release. We'd be looking to work the latimus dorsi. All these different areas will affect the trigger points themselves, and through use of stretching, we can stretch out that muscle tissue that I was speaking about, and in turn lose that knot that was in there before, okay? So stretching will be a really good method. And then finally, we also look to incorporate exercise into our clinical analysis and what we'd be doing in forms of treatment, as exercises like jumping jacks, exercises like swimming. They not only work the muscle, but they also work to stretch the muscle as well. Imagine if we're swimming, we're getting full movement through our arm, and it's able to work that muscle itself, get more blood to the area, and in turn get more oxygen to the area, get more nutrients there, and heal the injured tissues. So the last thing I'm going to do today is just talk to you guys about some other methods of prevention that we can use. Maybe you at home don't want to go into clinic, don't want to get a massage. There's definitely ways that we can look to reduce muscle knots just when at home as well. So for one, it's always good practice to have good posture. As I mentioned earlier, it can be really bad if we have hunched over shoulders, putting extra pressure through the muscles, making the capillaries sort of tighten, so we're not able to get blood flow to the area. So good posture is always something to practice. We want to be focused on sitting upright. We want to be getting our shoulders up, back and down. Definitely avoiding slouching. Another method of prevention is just to make sure we're getting enough sleep and we're getting adequate exercise as well. So for you guys who work at a desk job, if you're sitting down for 8 hours, 9 hours of the day, I would advise getting up for at least once every hour for about 5 minutes, just to stretch out the body, just to get it moving again. If we're just sitting in one position for 8 hours, that's going to be really detrimental to our health, cause muscle tightness, and eventually cause these muscle knots, okay? For my sport people out there, or my exercising people who like to go out for runs and stuff, I would always suggest having a warm-up and a cool-down after. So we want to be incorporating dynamic stretches into our warm-ups. We want to be making sure that if we've just been on a long run or just done a lot of exercise, we need to be stretching afterwards, because that buildup of lactic acid is going to be there. And if we're not stretching, that's going to cause that stickiness. That's going to cause that muscle contraction to stay where it is. The lactic acid is going to crystallize, and it's going to force our muscles to stay in that contracted position, okay? And that's why cool downs are so important after, a long game of rugby, long game of football, maybe a 10K run. Making sure that we're cooling down after is going to be essential for us, okay? What else can we do? Yeah, so other elements include watching our diet, so making sure that we get lots of magnesium, calcium, obviously. I spoke about the importance of calcium when it comes to muscles working. There are really important elements within our body, and if we're not eating healthy enough foods, we're definitely not going to be hitting the amount of calcium, the amount of magnesium that we need to keep the muscle working in the correct way. This as well with water, making sure we drink lots of water throughout the day will be massive to making sure we've got enough blood flow. And then finally, all I suggest is coming into clinic, getting a massage and trying to work through them. Getting on a rehab plan is going to be essential for them. Anyway, thank you for watching, guys. If you have any questions, please pop them in the comments. I'll be here for another minute or so. So if you have any questions at all, please let me know. Thank you very much for listening.